All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we are diving into something pretty fundamental when you think about biology. We're talking about evolution. And, it's one of those things that feels familiar, but when you start digging in, there's a lot there. And especially for you, coming at this as a philosopher, I think there's a whole other layer of questions to ask about how we define evolution, what it means, and all the philosophical implications of those definitions.
Yeah, I think you're right. Sometimes the most basic concepts are the ones we kind of take for granted and don't examine as closely. We're going to be looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on evolution. And it's a great resource because it gives a good overview of how scientists currently understand it. But for us, what's really interesting is that it also highlights where philosophy comes in. So we're going to dig into those points and kind of unpack them for you from that philosophical perspective.
Sounds good. So we need to start with the basics. When we say evolution in biology, we're generally talking about how the proportions of different biological types in a population change over time. Seems simple enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
But even in that basic definition, I feel like there are some philosophical questions lurking there.
Oh, absolutely. And it's interesting to think back to Darwin. In the first edition of On the Origin of Species, he actually didn't use the word evolution. He preferred the phrase descent with modification. And that wasn't just a matter of style. At that time, evolution already had all these other connotations, and Darwin was really trying to propose a very specific mechanism. So even the term itself had some baggage, right? Like it shows how scientific language isn't always neutral.
Right. And then you have what's called the modern synthesis, which happened in the mid-20th century. This is basically when Darwin's ideas got combined with what we know about genetics, like Mendel and all that. And that led to a really influential definition of evolution. It's based on population genetics. And it says that evolution is any change in the frequency of alleles within a population from one generation to the next. So it's very precise, very focused on those little changes in gene frequencies.
Yeah, and that definition was really powerful, especially for developing mathematical models and understanding inheritance. But like the entry points out, that definition, the allele frequency definition, it's inherently microevolutionary, right? It's about those small scale changes within a population. The idea is that those small changes underlie the big picture, like the emergence of new species and those big biological innovations, macroevolution. But the definition itself doesn't directly address that larger scale of evolution. And I think that highlights a really interesting tension. Like, the mechanisms at the gene level, they don't always translate easily to that grand narrative of how life has changed over time.
So if we're thinking about the bigger picture, it makes sense that we see broader definitions popping up, right? Like Futuyama, in his textbook, he defines biological evolution as change in the properties of groups of organisms over the course of generations. So that includes everything from those tiny allele shifts to those huge transformations that happen over millions of years.
Exactly. And Endler, he has another definition that kind of echoes that wider scope. He says evolution is any net directional change or any cumulative change in the characteristics of organisms or populations over many generations. In other words, descent with modification. It explicitly includes the origin as well as the spread of alleles, variants, trait values, or character states. So both of those definitions, they're moving beyond just the level of genes and looking at those observable characteristics, the phenotypes, and how those traits evolve in populations.
And the layers just keep going. You have molecular evolution, which focuses on changes in DNA and RNA. And then there's Van Valen, who gives this interesting ecological perspective. He says evolution is the control of development by ecology, which almost sounds like it's flipping things around, like emphasizing how the environment actually shapes the way organisms develop and therefore how they evolve. That kind of reminds me of the whole Evo-Devo movement. How an organism develops from an embryo can really influence what evolutionary paths are even possible. It's like philosophically recognizing that development is a key player in the evolutionary game.
It's a really interesting perspective from Van Valen. He's highlighting how interconnected everything is. It's not just genes acting on their own. It's about the constant interplay between organisms and their environments. That's what drives evolutionary change. And that idea of an extended evolutionary synthesis is all about trying to incorporate those newer findings from developmental biology and other fields to get a more complete understanding of evolution. It's about going beyond just that initial focus of the modern synthesis.
And this might blow your mind as a philosopher, but people have even started applying evolutionary ideas to culture. There's a whole field of cultural evolution that looks at how Ideas, behaviors, technologies, all of that stuff changes over time. They're finding all these parallels with biological evolution. And that opens up a whole can of worms, philosophically speaking. Like, what are the basic units of cultural evolution? How do they get transmitted? Are memes really like genes? Is cultural transmission a type of inheritance? So many questions.
Yeah, definitely lots of interesting debates happening there at the intersection of biology, anthropology, and philosophy. But here's something that I find really interesting, and the Stanford entry points it out too. There hasn't been a ton of philosophical analysis of the term evolution itself. I mean, we have a huge amount of philosophy of evolution, like thinking about how it works and what it means, but not so much focus on what evolution as a concept really signifies. It's kind of strange when you think about it. Like, for a long time, philosophy of biology was pretty much just philosophy of evolution. But lately, philosophers have branched out into other areas like genetics and ecology.
So as we've seen, defining evolution is tricky. It's not a simple thing. It happens on different levels, and you can look at it from different angles. But let's move on to how this whole evolution thing actually happens, the different modes of evolution. One thing that's important to remember, and it's something that often gets oversimplified, is that natural selection is only one way that evolution happens.
Right. The Stanford entry lays out several other important modes. You have genetic drift, mutation, migration, and sexual selection. And even Darwin, he struggled with this question of whether sexual selection should be seen as its own mode or just a special case of natural selection. There's still debate about that.
And in each of these modes, we're still talking about changes in allele frequencies in a population over time,
Oh, right.
right?
Yeah.
It's just that the underlying reason for those changes isn't always that some alleles are better at surviving and reproducing in a particular environment, like we think of with natural selection. Take genetic drift, for example. This is basically evolution driven by chance. It's about random fluctuations in allele frequencies from one generation to the next. It's not that some alleles are better. It's more like if you flip a coin a bunch of times, you might get streaks of heads or tails just by chance, even if the coin is fair.
Yeah.
Genetic drift is kind of like that, especially in small populations.
And what's interesting about genetic drift is that it can actually lead to an increase in the frequency of alleles that are neutral or even a little bit harmful. Just because of that sampling error, especially in small populations, it really highlights the role of randomness in evolution. And then you have mutation, which is the ultimate source of all near genetic variation. A mutation is basically a change in the DNA sequence, and that can introduce a brand new allele into the population, which of course immediately changes the allele frequencies, even if it's a small change at first.
And then there's migration, which is just organisms moving between populations. But that can have a big impact on allele frequencies, both in the population they came from and the population they go to. It can introduce new genetic variants or change the proportions of existing ones.
Exactly. And then you have sexual selection, which is all about those traits that affect an organism's ability to find a mate and reproduce. And this can lead to the evolution of all sorts of elaborate displays and behaviors, like intense competition for mates, or things that might even make it harder for the organism to survive, but help them reproduce more successfully. It's fascinating.
So the Stanford entry brings up this really interesting philosophical point when it's talking about these different modes. It connects them to the mathematical models that biologists use to study evolution. A lot of these models are based on statistics, and that's led to this debate between what they call causalist and statisticalist interpretations of natural selection and genetic drift. It makes you wonder, like, can we really say that these processes cause evolution? Or are they just statistical summaries of what's happening at a deeper level with births and deaths and all that?
Yep.
It's not just an abstract philosophical question either. It gets to the heart of how we understand evolution. Like, is it a predictable process driven by specific causes? Or is it more like a probabilistic unfolding of events?
Yeah, that's getting into some really deep philosophical territory about causation and evolutionary biology. And I think the term modes of evolution is helpful here because it's a neutral way to talk about all these different factors that contribute to evolutionary change, regardless of how we ultimately interpret their causal role.
It's worth pointing out, too, that even though we know about these different modes, there's still a big emphasis on natural selection in biology and in philosophy, too. And that leads to the whole debate about adaptationism. Like, is that focus on natural selection justified? Do we have good reason to think it's the most important or common mode of evolution? And should our scientific methods really prioritize testing hypotheses that are all about natural selection?
That's a crucial question, both in terms of how we do science and how we think about evolution philosophically. Are we sometimes too quick to assume that every trait is an adaptation carefully shaped by natural selection? Or is natural selection really the main driver of those complex adaptations we see? It's a debate that forces us to really think critically about our assumptions and the methods we use in evolutionary research.
And because natural selection plays such a central role, it makes sense that there's been a lot of philosophical work done on the concept of fitness. Like, what does it even mean for an organism to be fit? And what are we talking about when we say fitness? Does it apply to genes, individual organisms, groups? Is fitness something that's inherently probabilistic? And how do we actually measure it? These are all questions that philosophers have been grappling with. And the Stanford entry also points out that there's been less philosophical attention paid to some of those other modes, like migration, mutation as a direct evolutionary force, and even sexual selection, which seems like it could be really fertile ground for philosophical inquiry.
Definitely. It's interesting that those other modes haven't gotten as much attention from philosophers. It might be because natural selection has historically dominated how we think about evolution. But as biologists learn more about these other processes, I think we might see a shift in philosophical interest as well. It's all connected.
Okay, so we've tackled defining evolution, and we've looked at all the different ways it can happen. Now let's dive into some of the bigger philosophical debates that come up when we're talking about evolution. The Stanford entry highlights a few key areas where evolutionary biology and philosophy really intersect.
Yeah, one of the biggest ones, of course, is the whole discussion around creationism. The scientific evidence for evolution is overwhelming. But there are still philosophical disagreements about why creationism shouldn't be considered a valid scientific alternative, and why it shouldn't be taught as science in schools. Is it because it doesn't follow the rules of scientific inquiry? Is it because there's no real evidence for it? Or is it because it's fundamentally based on religious beliefs? Philosophically, it's important to recognize those different levels of argument.
And then there's the whole controversy surrounding sociobiology and evolutionary psychology. These fields try to explain human behavior and psychology in terms of evolution. But they've been criticized for putting too much emphasis on adaptation and for potentially bringing in biases into their explanations, which raises all sorts of important questions, like how far can we really go in explaining human traits using evolution? And how do we make sure we're not just projecting our own biases onto the past? There's a lot of careful thinking that needs to happen in those fields.
It's really important to be ethically and epistemologically aware when applying evolutionary principles to human behavior and cognition. Like, how do we ensure rigor in our research and avoid making unjustified claims? How do we distinguish between traits that are likely adaptations and those that might be byproducts of other evolutionary processes? Those are crucial questions for researchers in those fields.
Another big area is heredity and heritability. As we've been talking about, evolution is all about changes in heritable traits over time. But what does heritable even mean? Our understanding of that has expanded beyond just genes. Now it includes things like learning, cultural transmission, epigenetic inheritance, which is like changes in gene expression without altering the DNA sequence itself, and even ecological inheritance, which is basically where organisms change their environment in a way that affects the fitness of future generations. That's pretty wild.
And that expanded view of inheritance is really important for how we think about evolution. It challenges that idea that it's all about genes, and it highlights all the different ways that traits can be passed on. And the Stanford entry points out something that I think trips a lot of people up. It's that heritability is actually a technical term in genetics. It has a specific statistical meaning, which can lead to confusion when people are talking about it more generally. And that classic distinction between genotype and phenotype, genotype being the genes, phenotype being the traits that's being re-examined too, in light of these broader mechanisms of inheritance. So even that seemingly straightforward distinction between nature and nurture is getting more complicated. And then that leads to deeper philosophical questions about what biological information even is and how it gets transmitted across generations.
And all that takes us to thinking about replication, reproduction, and the units or levels at which selection happens. For heritable change to occur, something has to be replicated or reproduced. And philosophers and biologists have started using these broader terms, like replicators and vehicles. Instead of just talking about genes and organisms, it helps us think about the process more generally, like what's doing the copying and what's carrying those copies. It lets us ask, at what level does selection mainly operate? Is it at the level of the gene, the individual organism, the group, or even the species?
That's one of the biggest and most complex debates in evolutionary biology and philosophy. Are genes really the primary units of selection, with organisms just being temporary vehicles for those genes? Or does selection act mainly on individual organisms as whole, integrated entities? And can selection really work at higher levels, like groups or even entire species? These questions are all tied up with how we define biological individuality and what evolutionary change really means.
And speaking of biological individuality, the nature of species itself is a huge philosophical question in the context of evolution. A lot of philosophers argue that species should be seen as historical individuals, like lineages that evolve over time with a beginning and an end, instead of just being fixed categories or types. But interestingly, species are rarely thought of as direct units of selection.
That's an important distinction. While a species can definitely evolve over time, it might branch off into new species or go extinct. It's usually the individual organisms within a species that are directly facing the pressures of natural selection. The entry talks about Elizabeth Lloyd's work, where she suggests that species might be beneficiaries of evolution in the sense that they persist or diversify, but they're not usually the replicators or interactors that are directly involved in the selection process.
And then there's the whole challenge of even defining what a species is. There are all these different species concepts based on whether they can interbreed, their shared evolutionary history, their physical similarity, their ecological roles, and none of them seem to perfectly capture the amazing diversity of life. Which is why a lot of people think we need a pluralistic approach to species, recognizing that different concepts might be more useful in different situations. Even the act of trying to classify life into these neat little boxes called species raises all sorts of philosophical questions like, are species real objective things out there in the world? Or are they more like helpful groupings that we impose on nature to try and make sense of it?
And finally, the Stanford entry touches on evolutionary game theory, which is basically applying the math of game theory to evolutionary scenarios. And it's been really useful for understanding the evolution of behaviors, even those that seem paradoxical, like altruism, where an individual does something that benefits others, even if it potentially costs them something. Evolutionary game theory gives us a powerful way to model how organisms interact and to figure out how different behavioral strategies can evolve depending on what other individuals in the population are doing. And studying altruism often takes us back to those fundamental questions about levels of selection, like can altruism evolve because it benefits the group as a whole, even if it's not the best strategy for the individual?
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think what's really striking, especially for you as a philosopher, is just how much conceptual depth there is to this idea of evolution. It's not just a biological process. It raises all these profound philosophical questions about how we define things, how life works, and what it all means.
I agree. We've seen how the definition of evolution is still evolving itself. It goes from those very precise genetic definitions to broader perspectives that take into account organisms and their environments. We've explored all the different ways that evolutionary change can happen. And we've highlighted that natural selection is just one piece of the puzzle, even though it's an important one. And we've touched on so many philosophical debates, from the nuances of heredity and how we define a species, to those big questions about levels of selection and how evolutionary thinking applies to human behavior and culture.
And all that leads to one final thought for you to ponder as you continue your philosophical journey. Given all these different definitions and all the different ways that evolution can happen, what does it really mean to say that a species has evolved? Does focusing only on changes in gene frequencies really capture the whole picture of how groups of organisms change over these vast stretches of time? That's something to think about as you keep exploring these fascinating intersections between biology and philosophy. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.